Good evening, viewers. We now bring you a statement on the Gambia government's position on the tragedy in Cote d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast, and the statement reads: The events in Ivory Coast have vindicated us on our earlier assertion that Western neo-colonialist sponsored agents in Africa that owe allegiance only to themselves and their Western masters are ready to walk on thousands of dead bodies to the presidency. This is what is happening in Ivory Coast. Africans should not only wake up, but should stand up to the new attempts to recolonize Africa through so-called elections that are organized just to fool the people, since the true verdict of the people would not be respected if it does not go in favor of the Western-backed candidate, as has happened in Cote d'Ivoire and elsewhere in Africa. What is really sinister and dangerous about the neo-colonialist threat is that they are ready to use brute force or carry out outrageous massacres to neutralize any form of resistance to the Western-selected president, as has happened in Ivory Coast. In Cote d'Ivoire, we know the role played by the former colonial power who, outside of the UN mandate, first bombarded the presidential palace for days and eventually stormed it through a tunnel that links the presidential palace to one of the residences of their diplomatic representative. The reasons for the bombardment of the presidential palace prior to the raid was, according to them, to prevent Gbagbo using heavy weapons against civilians. But both the UN and France were aware of the outrageous massacres of civilians. Entire villages that supported President Laurent Gbagbo were wiped out by so-called Republican forces fighting for Ouattara. Were Gbagbo supporters not supposed to be protected by the UN and French forces against massacres? These so-called Republican forces were supposed to be fighting for democracy, ended up killing thousands with impunity, and are now engaged in massive looting. Our position is very clear. The case of Laurent Gbagbo is a replica of the case of Patrice Lumumba, who, as a freedom fighter for the dignity and independence of not only Congolese people, but the entire black race, was overthrown by Western powers, including the UN, and handed over to his sworn enemies to be murdered. History is repeating itself, as the same neo-colonial forces that overthrew Patrice Lumumba, captured him and handed him over to his enemies almost 50 years ago, are the same forces involved in the Ivory Coast, with the only difference being that it is now a different former colonial power. If justice is to be done, there should be an impartial and comprehensive investigation into all the atrocities carried out in the Ivory Coast by a team of honest and decent Allah-fearing people. Alassane Ouattara and his forces cannot go scot-free and blame everything on President Laurent Gbagbo, who, according to the Ivorian constitution, is the legitimate president of Ivory Coast. This team should be selected by the non-aligned movement. One is tempted to ask this question: how is it possible that the verdict of the Constitutional Council that decided on who won the elections in some Francophone African countries recently were accepted, that is, after the election in Ivory Coast, but that of the Constitutional Council in Ivory Coast was rejected by both the Western powers and the UN? As far as we are concerned, the only solution to avert a long drawn-out civil war with all its attendant consequences in Ivory Coast is to recognize or reorganize presidential elections in the shortest possible time. In the meantime, an interim government of national unity should be formed without Alassane Ouattara, as he also has a lot to answer for as well. One thing is very clear to all Africans today: the plot to recolonize Africa is very real, and we must stand up to it. It is shameful that the most evil, dictatorial and repressive powers on earth today are calling African leaders dictators. It is also very shocking and interesting as well that the same powers are not saying anything about the popular uprising that has been raging on in Burkina Faso for the past 3 weeks, resulting in the storming of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou last night, with the whereabouts of Blaise Compaore unknown. This uprising has been going on for more than 3 weeks now, and not a single international news media is reporting on it. It is possible in today's world that such an uprising can take place in a country like Burkina Faso, so close to the Ivory Coast, a dusk-to-dawn curfew imposed for 2 weeks without the Western media, including those of the former colonial master, knowing about it. We, the new generation of Africans, cannot and will not be fooled. We know what Blaise Compaore stands for in Africa with regards to the West. Captain Thomas Sankara was murdered for standing up to the imperialism and neocolonialism in Burkina Faso in particular and Francophone Africa in general. He was killed for the same reasons that Patrice Lumumba and other African freedom fighters died for, their killers eventually becoming presidents in those African countries and worked exclusively for Western interests in Africa. Blaise Compaore is one of them. He has a lot to answer for the civil wars that ravaged Liberia, Sierra Leone and Ivory Coast then and now. That there is such a media blackout of the uprising in Burkina Faso, but an up-to-the-minute reporting of events in Yemen, Syria, Ivory Coast, etc., shows that the so-called international news media are the mouthpieces of certain satanic powers with a sinister mission for the rest of the world outside the West. Why can't the West respect Africa's independence and dignity? In conclusion, we call on the UN to ensure the safety, protection and well-being of President Laurent Gbagbo, the constitutionally legal President of Ivory Coast, and set him free. He cannot be tried whilst Alassane Ouattara, the internationally selected president, goes scot-free after massacring thousands of civilians just to be president. The Gambia government will not recognize any president or government in Africa that has been imposed by forces outside of the African continent for whatever reason. We know what those governments and presidents stand for in Africa. They loot African resources on behalf of the powers that brought them to power. May Allah the Almighty guard and protect Africans by giving us the courage to stand up in defense of African independence, dignity, and the protection of our natural resources from those hungry locusts on the rampage in Africa. The road to total liberation may be tough, but we shall prevail very soon, inshallah. That was a statement released by the Gambia government on its position on the tragedy in Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast. Thank you.